Thank you all. I want to especially thank Suhail and Microsoft for two reasons. I've been involved with that for over a decade, and I know in the summer it's hard to find the venue because they're all taken up by interns. The second reason I want to explicitly thank Suhail and Microsoft is to cushion the blow of a lot of what I'm about to say. Honestly, the biggest threat to economic liberty and to the free market in America today is big business and their lobbies. And think about what we went through this morning. Do you know that that bill had the full support of the single biggest lobbying organization in this city representing an industry? Not the Chamber of Commerce. They were mostly against it. In this case, they were against big government. But the biggest single industry lobby is the pharmaceutical researchers and manufacturers of America. And if you measure all the companies in any industry, the industry that spends the most on lobbying is the drug industry. And if you've read some of the stuff that Phil Klein or I have written at the Examiner, Kim Strassel had a column on this at the Wall Street Journal, some other news outlets have covered the degree to which the drug lobbyists and Max Baucus and the Obama White House worked together to write this bill. They didn't just shape it, they ensured that it passed. Had it not been for the drug lobby and the other industries, the American Hospital Association, the American Medical Association, had it not been for them, the bill wouldn't have passed. And you know what? The first draft, the first people to come up with the idea of an individual mandate in health insurance, I think you can probably guess who that was. It was right after Obama won re-election. The American Health Insurance Plans lobby came out, and they said, we will cover everybody. We will no pre-existing condition exclusions. We won't charge you a ton more for being sick. We'll have sort of price bands that we limit ourselves to, as long as you, the way they always put it was, ensure that everyone participates. That then changed to personal responsibility, and now today we learned it was a tax. So that was Obamacare for you. But if you look at all of Obama's biggest legislative initiatives, even his successes and his failures, he has big business lobbies on his side doing much of the work. The stimulus, huge support from the Chamber of Commerce, huge support from all the industry lobby groups. His Waxman-Markey bill, that's the climate change. He had the Chamber of Commerce against him in that case, but he had General Electric, which is a company that spends the most on lobbying. That was on his side. Duke Energy was on his side. British Petrol, or BP, call them British Petroleum now, the British people get really upset because they're just BP, which they told us stands for Beyond Petroleum, but other people call it Bubbling Petroleum. BP, Duke Energy, AES, Alcoa, all these big businesses supporting Waxman-Markey, pushing it across the finish line in the House, never got it to pass the Senate. But this is how the Democrats sell their legislation now. There's so many Republicans, conservatives, who think that they're fighting against an anti-business president. They think that they're fighting against Ralph Nader still. And they say, oh, these guys don't want anyone making a profit. And Romney will say some of that this fall. And that's ridiculous. Because Obama can say, you think I don't want anyone making a profit? Look at GE. Look at Lockheed Martin. Look at Boeing. Look at Chrysler. I mean, we bought them out. We're handing them profit. Look at Pharma, Pfizer. He brings out there all these CEOs and say, I'm letting all these guys make a profit. So you're fighting the wrong enemy if you're fighting against sort of the special interest groups like the environmentalists or the anti-capitalists or a lot of Occupy Wall Street. That's not the enemy. If what you care about is free markets, the enemy right now, especially what's pushing the left's ball, is going to be the faction that Matt was talking about. And on the right, what corrupts Republicans? When Republicans controlled the White House and Congress, what were the two biggest things they did as far as increasing the size of government? The number one answer is obvious, TARP. Yes, they had Wall Street behind them and the Chamber of Commerce behind them. In my opinion, the number two answer is the Medicare Prescription Drug Act, expanding Medicare to cover prescription drugs. That was, again, basically written by the drug industry, and as Barack Obama pointed out in a campaign ad, drug industry then hired up the Commerce Committee chairman, Billy Tozan, to be their top lobbyist, so that was pretty cushy. And the insurers loved it too, because it funneled everybody through this profit-taking middleman that was the insurance companies in Medicare Part D. And it's not just handouts, it's regulation. The number one supporter of the Tobacco Regulation Act that Obama signed in the summer of 2009 was Philip Morris, which controls a majority of the U.S. tobacco market. They knew that regulation would crush their smaller competitors. They knew that limiting advertising would freeze in place their market share, which was about 50% of the market. They knew that they would be able to game the regulatory system. So after a bill becomes a law, it then gets regulated. I read some of those regulatory dockets on the FDA regulation of tobacco. I read this one by a guy who runs a company called Smoking Joe's, and I think it was his sister-in-law has this handwritten regulatory filing saying, you can't do this thing you're proposing where you're saying we can't hand out free samples to retailers because basically all we do is we go up to guys who own gas stations and stores and say, here, try our cigarettes. They're grown 2 miles away and they're great and they smoke them and they love them. That's how we get it out. We can't afford a bigger distribution model. And then you read the regulatory filing by Philip Morris, and it's by a former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, is the lawyer Philip Morris, sort of tweaking the edges of this and there and just asking for a little bit of clarity there. H&R Block. The CEO of H&R Block left, joined the Obama administration's IRS, and proceeded to write a regulation regulating tax preparers so that they would have to go through these rigmaroles. If you guys follow the Institute for Justice, the sort of things they do for hair cutting, interior design. I know we have an interior designer in here somewhere. Interior design, all that stuff. Basically, H&R Block CEO wrote those rules to curb tax prep. H&R Block and Jackson Hewitt, the two biggest supported this. They stand to benefit from this regulation that crushes competition. So then the question is, if you look at it from the perspective, and I vaguely recall this being a Milton Friedman quote, maybe someone can correct me, but I think he said, in response to liberal cries about corporate social responsibility, he said the social responsibility of a corporation is to make a profit. So then all of a sudden, are we in a pickle? If we agree with that, and we think that these things that these corporations are doing is bad. And one of the things to do is, yes, you blame the politicians. What they used to say, and my wife told me this is now an outdated saying, is don't hate the player, hate the game. And that was sort of the lesson of the column I wrote talking about Microsoft on Monday. Orrin Hatch's primary was on Tuesday. I figured use that as a news hook, get one last body blow in on him, and remind people what he did in 1998, where he had hearings while the FTC, while the courts are looking into Microsoft supposedly being a monopolist, even though the browser they were selling wasn't even the #1 browser at the time. So they're getting beat up by government, but Hatch decides he's going to have his own hearings too. And a couple years later, he's talking to a bunch of tech companies at a conference, and what he said was, if you want to get involved in business, you should get involved in politics. I talked to the lobbyists while I was writing this story, and they said, you can sit there and say, we despise Washington and we don't want to have anything to do with them, but guess what? We're going to have hearings about the crap that you do. And one lobbyist told another journalist at the time, you look at a guy like Gates who's been arrogant and cheap, note that word, cheap, and incredibly naive about politics, he genuinely believed that because he was creating jobs or whatever, that would be enough. Okay, so setting aside the infuriating message of that, cheap meant that Microsoft spent only $2 million on lobbying in 1997. I think instead of being here, the offices were up in Chevy Chase. Literally in their DC sales office, there was a guy who, when I looked him up, I found that he wrote this book about the best gay nightclubs in DC and how to, and it was this really interesting. I wish I remembered the name of it, but I almost bought it as part of the research for my column, but then I realized the shipping address would go to home, my wife. So only $2 million on lobbying in 1997. In that election cycle, they contributed only $50,000 from their PAC, so that was cheap.